Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. It's an honor to once again appear before you this morning. I'd like to start my testimony with two reminders. First, the EU is qualitatively and quantitatively our strongest global ally. It's based on, as we just heard, a set of shared values, including rule of law, openness, property rights, democracy, and for the most part, market economics. Transatlantic economy generates $5.3 trillion in commercial sales each year and employs up to 15 million workers on both sides of the Atlantic. European-controlled companies in the U.S. employed roughly 3.5 million Americans in 2011. An economically strong Europe is in our national interest. My second reminder is that the European Union is fundamentally a political project. Although the euro is obviously an economic instrument, its introduction remains principally an outgrowth of political motivations. Perhaps paradoxically, to understand European economic issues, one needs to always remember to look primarily through a political prism. European leaders often note that their progress should be viewed as one would a marathon and not a sprint. By that standard, it is early in the race, and there are significant hurdles still ahead. Europe currently suffers from a broken monetary transmission mechanism, a dearth of available credit, lingering concerns about potential exits from the euro, fragmentation across the European Union, and a negative feedback loop between banks and sovereigns. While borrowing costs have stabilized, in large part due to aggressive action by the ECB, the short-term economic outlook for Europe remains dim, with an expected 0.1% decline in GDP across the EU predicted for this year. So while the worst economic outcomes have been averted, Europe today suffers from stagnation, high unemployment, and a banking system in serious need of shoring up. Now, in spite of this assessment, the European response over the past 3 years has actually been far more aggressive, effective, and positive than is generally acknowledged. Europe today is significantly more stable and prepared for future events than virtually anyone could have predicted 3 years ago. Over that relatively brief time span, Europe has created a permanent rescue fund with up to 500 billion euros available for program countries, created a temporary rescue fund with an additional 200 billion euros available and already utilized in programs for several countries, seen the ECB expand its limited mandate to heighten focus on the stability of the financial system, undertaken significant fiscal, structural, and financial sector reforms in multiple countries, and reached an agreement on the creation of a single banking supervisory mechanism. This progress has been painful and remains insufficient. But 3 years ago, each of these steps would have been seen as politically, legally, or economically impossible. Now, with respect to the IMF, its involvement in the euro crisis was initially resisted by many leaders in European countries, in part because it was seen as too technocratic and not politically malleable enough to play a constructive role. It could not be counted on to succumb to political pressures to avoid politically unpalatable outcomes. And yet the IMF's unparalleled expertise led to its inclusion in the Troika, along with the European Commission and the ECB, which together have led the crisis response. Perhaps the most important contribution made by the IMF was as the principal driver of program design, surveillance, and review. And when the IMF did provide financial support, it did so with strict conditionality and with strong support from its executive board. This is not to say the IMF performed flawlessly. At times, the fund sent confusing messages on the great economic debate of our time, colloquially known as austerity versus spending. And the IMF accepted assumptions in the initial Greek program that were proven woefully incorrect. But even then, the IMF played a crucial and positive role. When a country's economic survival is in question, even the IMF needs to balance its role as honest truth teller with the risk of triggering the very consequences that everyone seeks to avoid. Now, for Europe, as with any marathon, the race does not get easier as it progresses, it gets harder. The issues looming ahead are daunting. They involve the potential for stronger countries to find themselves taking on the risks of weaker ones, with the potential quid pro quo of asking those seeking support to agree to rule changes that could include the loss of some element of national sovereignty. This presents a delicate and potentially destabilizing dynamic, putting Germany and France, the two most important founding members of what is today the EU, on a path towards increasingly uncomfortable conflict. Now, to conclude, while frustrating, inefficient, complicated, and often painful to watch, the evolution of the European Union is something that we as Americans should continue to encourage. While I don't wish to belabor the marathon analogy, those who complete the race often cite the encouragement they receive from those cheering them on along the way. It's in our national interest to remain invested and engaged in Europe's success. Thank you.